So what I was going to ask, first of all, Bob, is what brought you to the centre in the first place?
It's a bit of a convoluted story, but I'll keep it brief. I was doing an MA at the University of Essex, and toward the end of the first year I was involved in student activities. As far as I can recall, Shay Williams had into the new policy. We had a Labour government and then decided to introduce overseas student fees. Now, for most people today, student fees are taken for granted, but then Indigenous students have free education and that remained. So many overseas students they had to pay. So what it meant was that unless the poor student could get a bursary from their own government, then a lot of students came from wealthy backgrounds. So it actually brought in inequality at various levels. So we had a number of sit-ins and protests, and because I was a high-profile student activist, because I have shared before it, I stood up and they decided as a ringleader they would punish me. So first of all I was expelled, and then on appeal it was changed to a 2-year ban. The irony was that literally a week of ban I received a grant to do a PhD, and after negotiations all sides agreed who I could find another uni to take me, then I could keep the grant. And after various inquiries, the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies offered me a place, but that wasn't the end of the story. I was given the place, was about to drive up to Essex, up to Birmingham from Essex, when I was told I was suspended by the university checked me out. But both Stuart Hall and Richard Johnson made the case for me.
So before you'd even arrived at Birmingham, you were suspended?
Yeah.
And Richard and Stuart stepped in to overturn that?
Made an academic argument that I would make a contribution to the centre, and therefore they would, if they like, take responsibility for my behaviour.
Had you heard much about the centre before?
To be honest, no, because it was a complete surprise. But I had talked with Richard over the phone where he asked me about my idea, what my interest was, what my studies involved. And therefore I think lapsed off my known radical ideas anyway, maybe a fertile student, if you know.
And what when you arrived then, when all that was out of the way and the suspension was overturned, what was it? How would you just describe the atmosphere at the centre?
Well, it was both different and similar to what I knew. First of all, being again politically active, being a Marxist, I already got into big debates about politics and enjoyed arguments and exchanging views. So I'm familiar with that kind of background, but at the centre, it was just at a very higher intellectual level. First of all, I really did feel a fish out of water because a lot of the debate just went completely over my head. So, I was okay discussing Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, etc. But talking about postmodernist discourse after the like was, what is this stuff? Yeah.
But was it like, I mean, did you find it kind of, the politics of the centre matched your own politics? And did you enjoy the fact that there was a political kind of atmosphere to it?
No, it didn't match my politics, but that partly what made it intriguing, because I don't think they matched anybody's politics as such, because I often talk about the eclectic nature of the centre, because you didn't have harmony. Yeah, I think I know still Albright wrote about this, where he talked about various different discourses being played within the centre. So you had different groups of people pitching their argument, pitching their different views, and then they would be debated, argued about throwing out thought that kicked around. And that really made it exciting and different from any other experience I have ever had before or since.
So what were the kind of different forms of politics that were being, kicked about, like you say?
Well, I think you had lots of different sides. As I said, you had the kind of really academic postmodernist discussion from different theoretical levels. But you also had, if you like, people from the Communist Party who have developed their own interpretation of, say, Gramsci. Then you have Paul Gilroy and myself, who had contact with Big Flame on the International Marxist Group. Then you had a group of feminists who again had a variety of different positions on feminism.
And with the fact that there were so many kind of different perspectives flying around, did that make it ever the process of being at the centre and like kicking it around, to use that analogy again, was that ever like a kind of traumatic experience, or was it generally quite conducive to collaboration?
It was tension. We used to have, I think with the Monday night time, have a centre whole meeting about Stuart Mitchell or Michael Green. And we would discuss what was going on in the centre. And often a lot of the politics and discourses played out in that arena. And when you got like 30 odd students packed in a small room, it could get heated in more ways than one. But it was exciting. And like for me, as I said, having been involved in politics and student occupation, it did remind me of those kind of meetings and occupations where you discuss what's our next move. And in some ways, you know, we like Ferguson, right? It's them versus the world. Therefore, we the centre have to defend our right to exist against those who will do us harm. So that was always a bit of a subtext.
Was there? I mean, did you feel like you were under siege? Like, was there a threat? Were you aware of like the centre's relationship with the University of Birmingham and the wider world?
I think so. I think it partly because Centre had this left wing reputation, but it was also because I think the university didn't understand what was going on there. They couldn't fathom out the way it worked, the collaborative way of working, the kind of debates. So what you don't understand, you see as a threat. I think that was always the case. And it was almost like a kind of duality. Yeah, I think this that Birmingham, on the one hand they wished it would go away, yet on the other hand they were prepared to bask in its sunlight when it got book published and widely recognised. So it was that Jekyll and Hyde type creature.
I mean, what was that? You talked a little bit about the weekly meetings. I was going to ask you what the kind of, when you were at the centre, what did the average week look like for you? Can you remember?
Vaguely. I mean, it was divided. You came in when you had meetings. I was involved in one or two subgroups, or if there was a talk, I would go. The rest of the time, I would work at home on my own research, or I was permitted to work in the library on my own material. So it was quite a fluid relationship. You weren't there all the time.
Can you remember anything about the theory seminars that took place?
Again, we told you about a very, very long time ago. No.
Okay, and then, because obviously the other thing I was going to ask you about was that you were crucial with like Paul Gilroy and John Solomos in establishing the race subgroup. How did that come about?
It was interesting because originally I wanted to finish off my own MA research that was on Kafka and his work and interpreting it from the left perspective. However, through discussion with Paul and anti-racist activities, I began to think about what I was going to move on to do it in film. and I decided I wanted to look at the issue of race in terms of the media, how the media tended to reflect upon black people, alien to British culture, way of life. And at the time I wasn't very familiar with the term other, but really that was the kind of issue I was looking at. It also reflected my own experience as a disabled person, how the media and society didn't view me the same way as I view myself. So that's my interest. And because race and Lawrence also there, we started talking about our individual work and interest around race and racism. And we decided it might be a good idea to have a meeting of people who were interested in that area, because there'd been a publication of work around women called Women Take Issue. And though Stuart Hall was a written piece in the crisis, that was more to do with the media and reaction to it. Touched on my work, but we thought it was a bigger issue around how race would be articulated within society. So we put out the call in the weekly meeting about what people like to come together and discuss issues of race, their own work, and maybe doing something collaborative. And that really how Paul got to set up the group.
Well, and what was the actual process of collaboration like? Because obviously there was a big, at the centre that anyway, there was an emphasis on collaborative work. What was it like in your experience?
It was interesting. Early on we just talked and expressed different views on our different takes. Nothing concrete was put forward. Then via Amos it was to actually program maybe we could write a joint work together, and that was eventually agreed. And then we discussed basically what kind of issues we would like to see covered by that book. And the Empire Soapback, it has the first chapter, which if you kind of overview of the politics and situating it, and the rest of the book is the individual essay by one person or a group of people on key themes like education, for example. And then, in our meeting we were talking about the directions people wanted to go in. We would then say, yeah, agreed. What about this? What about that? And we thought about this angle. So it was like they would write draft, we would read and discuss them, make changes, argue, disagree, file, reform, come back and carry on.
I mean, what was the motivation? Was it, I mean, in writing the book, was it kind of just to get your ideas out there, or was it, did people have an idea that they wanted to become academics and so the book was a way of doing that? Or can you remember anything about that?
I would never say that was. maybe a hidden desire, I'm not sure, but I genuinely believe it was a commitment to anti-racist practices and really wanting to articulate the same way thinking on race. We also collectively and individually took issue with how others have been writing on race at the time. So we sort of ask, so in a way, like offering something new, yet critiquing some of the old stuff, like John Rex and his material. Yeah.
So it's kind of a step revising the established kind of orthodoxy at the same time forming part of the anti-racist struggle that you got. I mean, were you active in that?
I'm monitoring people where other people have had different issues which sort of fed into their interest and work on the book. And Paul Shell knew other black writers and activists who he drew upon, and it was also some local activists who were involved in the book as well.
Can you remember any names or not really?
Yes, it was Rakib Hassan, who was working for Rover at the time, the car manufacturers, and he went on to be a Labour councillor in Birmingham. And I believe he then helped set up an independent political party of Pakistani activists. I'm a bit vague on that, so I never followed it up.
I mean, the other thing I was going to ask you as well, in regard to The Empire Strikes Back, but also more generally at the centre, what was the role of the staff members of, you know, so Stuart, Richard, Michael, and later on Maureen? What was their influence?
They would come and would listen to what we were saying. If there was a dispute, they would come and referee. But they never really imposed their will on us unless they thought it was a threat to the centre's integrity or we were going completely off track into unsafe areas. But that was very rare. On the whole, they were just supportive and let us get on with the work.
I mean, obviously there was a commitment at the centre to, you know, kind of breaking down like the conventional, you know, boundaries between like scholars and students. Was there ever demand that you can remember, or a desire among students to be more involved in the kind of ownership of the centre?
I think that was always there. It was always one of those push and pull type situations. But I think no one ever really lost clarity about it was a university-run centre and there were certain norms and values that we had to adhere to.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I was going to ask as well is about the kind of looking back at the period in that time, late 70s and early 80s. What do you think the structures were that made the centre possible in that existence the way it was? The kind of what was important about the conjuncture, if you like?
I think on the whole, as I said, you got the centre's internal politics of us versus the world in a way at the academic level. But at the political level, we were going through the Thatcherite period. It was very much them and us. I mean, even after I left, we had the 1984, the miners' strike, and those kind of issues. So it was like understanding how the outside world impacted upon the centre, but also how the centre and people in it could impact upon the wider world, and like the pressures that came from both directions.
So because when you left the centre, you went off and did other things. Other people stayed within academia. But what from your own perspective, what was the centre's impact then?
I have been huge. I mean, obviously becoming a Marxist at Essex, being involved in the political group, that gave me my own practice, my own foundations for the kind of world I had. But really the centre, being there, writing, discussing, listening, having, as I said, that eclecticism of ideas has actually stuck with me all through the last 30 odd years. Because to me it's what has shaped the way I work, write, think. So it really helped formulate me as an analytical person. And I would be indebted to the centre for that opportunity to learn that kind of practice.
Just finally then, just to wrap things up then, I know you're writing now some different works. Is that the kind of things where you were talking about and grappling with at the centre still influencing the things that you're trying to think about and grapple with now?
Yeah. I didn't finish my own research. The Empire Strike Back took over, mainly on the first chapter, and then my own circumstances changed, had to get a job, which I did. So that limited my involvement, but as I said, my interest was on media issues. And after I left the centre, but I slowly became more and more interested and involved in disability politics and became chair of the civil rights organisation Britain at one point. So disability politics became my main focus. About 3 years ago, I actually wrote a dissertation for an MA in disability studies, looking at disability representation in the media. That will link back to the centre, and now I'm writing 2 books. If I finish it, one is about my own life, my own feedback from how I've come to be where I am today. The other one was academic and political, which is about how the modern disabled people movement in Britain emerged, what passage it went to, where we are today, with cutbacks and the resistance that you've been mounted by some disabled people. So I'm trying to analyse what went right and also what went wrong. I'm trying to offer my take as someone who was in the heart of that movement. And a lot of what I'm writing is actually drawing on ideas and concepts borrowed from the Empire Strikes Back. So I don't think race and disability are any ways the same. There are issues like social construct, the specificity of how race and disability have been struggled over and used as controlling ideologies. So all those things inform my understanding of disability politics.
Because I mean, you only came into the disability politics like a bit later, didn't you? After the centre, is that right? So in a way, you could, in a sense, you came at disability politics through your work on race. Obviously, notwithstanding all the kind of complexities and grey areas that go hand in hand with that.
On the whole, yes, I did have a brief flirtation in my early time at Essex, but I decided that was not the way I wanted to go at that point in time. So I did come back. So yeah, it is pub-centred. Actually, Paul Gilmore was one of the people that inspired me, gave me a kick up the backside to get involved with disabled people again. I was complaining about the discriminatory practice that I personally experienced. He was saying, well, what are you going to do about it? I was saying, what are you going to do? He said, go and find out there are groups that are working on this kind of issue, find them, which I did.
Great, well, Bob, thank you very much.
Thank you.